You've arrived at Cozy Side Audio, where dreams begin with a story. Tonight's tale is here to help you wind down and find peace. If this brings you comfort, please like, share, and subscribe so more dreamers can join us. Let the night carry you, and let's begin.
CozySideAudio presents Whispers in the Canopy. Chapter 1. The forest watches quietly. The road twisted like a ribbon through the green. Trees leaned in overhead, their crowns whispering secrets to one another in the hush of summer heat. Mio pressed her forehead against the window glass, watching the canopy flicker with passing sunlight, her breath leaving a faint fog against the pane. Somewhere beneath the hum of the bus engine, she could hear the drone of cicadas, soft at first, then rising as the valley deepened around them. The bus was nearly empty. A single elderly man nodded along with the sway of the ride near the back, and the driver occasionally muttered something into his radio. Mio kept her satchel clutched on her lap, her fingers worrying the frayed corner of a field guide she hadn't cracked open in weeks. She wasn't sure what she expected from the village. Her parents hadn't told her much, just that they'd be overseas for a while and that her uncle had agreed to look after her. She'd never met him. Her memories of the region were paper-thin, a photograph in a summer album, her mother's voice naming the flowers that had once bloomed here, yamabuki, ajacai, kikyo, and a vague impression of mist and birdsong. The bus hissed to a stop beside an unmarked post. The road ahead bent deeper into the trees, disappearing entirely. The driver turned, gave her a small nod. "This is yours, right, Kazahara?" She rose, offering a quick bow and a quiet "thank you," then stepped down into the warm breath of the mountain air. The road was silent behind her before she'd even finished looking around. The bus had vanished as if it had never been there. Ahead, a narrow footpath opened between tall grasses and cypress trees, inviting and still. Mio adjusted the strap of her satchel and began to walk. The path felt older than the road. Uneven stone, lichen-covered and cracked, peeked through the packed dirt in places, like the bones of something ancient buried beneath. Leaves rustled with a slow confidence overhead, their motion deliberate, as though acknowledging her presence rather than stirred by wind. She paused now and then to listen, to the distant trickle of water, to the creak of wood far above, to the indistinct shuffle of small creatures keeping pace just out of sight. When the trees finally parted, her uncle's house revealed itself like a memory returned. It stood tucked against a slope, wooden and low, half covered in ivy and shadows. The roof tiles bore a coat of moss, and the windows were all open to let in the summer air. A pair of boots rested neatly beside the entrance, next to a broom and an empty water bucket. She stepped closer. The smell of cedar and sun-warmed stone drifted out to greet her. "Mio?" The voice was quiet but carried. She turned and saw him tall, with sun-lined eyes and hair pulled back in a loose tie, a canvas shirt half unbuttoned and sleeves rolled. Her uncle stood beneath the eaves, a bundle of firewood in his arms. She gave a small bow. "It's nice to meet you." He smiled, not wide, but genuine, and set the wood down. "You've grown." It felt strange, hearing that from someone who hadn't seen her since she was 3. Still, she nodded. "I hope the trip wasn't too long," he added. "Come inside. You look like you've brought half the heat with you." The house smelled like paper and trees. The walls were lined with shelves, some filled with field guides, others with carved stones, feathers, dried leaves pressed under glass. Mio followed her uncle through a hallway that creaked in familiar, friendly ways. Her room was small but sunlit, a futon already laid out beside the window, and a stack of folded linens resting atop a chest. "You'll hear the river from here," he said, nodding toward the open window. "It rises in the evenings. Good for sleeping." She looked out. Beyond the house, the land dropped gently into a thick stretch of woodland, stitched with winding trails and silver glints of water. "You really live in the forest," she murmured. He chuckled. "The forest lives around me. I just try to stay out of its way." Later, she found the journal. It was tucked beneath a coil of twine in the cupboard by the kitchen, a thick notebook, worn at the edges, its spine repaired with cloth tape. She opened it cautiously, expecting lists of supplies or trail notes. But the pages held something else entirely. The oaks near the south bend are sulking again. I suspect the wind teased them too roughly last night, cracking a few twigs they were fond of. I left an offering of chestnuts to cheer them up. Moss is listening better lately. It remembers shoes too loudly, though. I asked it to be more gentle with Mio when she arrives. She blinked. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Page after page, written in this quiet, almost conspiratorial tone, as if he were corresponding with the forest rather than observing it. There were little sketches of stones, branches, patterns, and bark. Beneath one drawing of a heron standing in the mist, he'd written, "She waits each morning for the moment the sun touches her back. Nothing before then matters. A discipline I envy." Mio turned a page and read her own name again. I hope she hears them. Some do, some don't. It's not about ears, it's about stillness. That kind of listening takes time. A sound caught her attention, a subtle rustle from the porch. When she looked up, her uncle was there, setting a tray of tea on the floor. He didn't mention the journal in her hands, didn't glance at it, only said, "I made mugwort tea. From the garden. Thought you might be thirsty." She closed the notebook gently and accepted the cup. The warmth of it spread through her fingers like sunlight pressing into skin. He sat down across from her, cross-legged, his gaze on the trees. "Out here," he said, "everything speaks. You just have to be quiet long enough to let them finish what they're saying." That night, Mio couldn't sleep. The river murmured beneath her window, full of thoughts too slow for words. The trees shifted gently outside, and every once in a while, the floor beneath her creaked, not from movement, but as if the wood itself remembered footsteps. She thought of the journal, of the moss listening, of the oaks sulking, of the heron waiting for the sun. A breeze pushed through the window screen, cool and fragrant. Something about it felt like a question. She whispered back, not words, just breath, and let the silence take her. Chapter 2: The Sound Beneath the Leaves. Mio awoke before the light filled the room. The air was still, and the wooden beams above her seemed to float in shadow. She listened for the soft drone of cicadas, but there were none yet. In their place, the brittle clicks of dew rolling from leaf tips, a drip of water echoing faintly in a distant basin, and the lightest rasp of something brushing against bark. Everything outside had already begun its day. She rose slowly, without speaking, without thought. The tatama felt cool against her feet, and the scent of cedar lingered in the weave. The paper screens were cracked just enough to show the faintest hint of blue. The forest didn't wait for permission. It simply continued. By the time she crossed the narrow hallway, her uncle was outside. The door had been left open, and the quiet clink of pottery echoed from the engawa. She paused before stepping out. From this angle, he looked like part of the scenery, a man built not to disturb what surrounded him. He was seated cross-legged beside a low table with a kettle nestled into a clay stove. A line of steam coiled upward without urgency. She sat opposite him. He poured the tea without a word. No greeting, no questions. Only the smooth motion of lived routine. The tea was darker than the one from yesterday. It smelled faintly of toasted earth and stone fruit. "I roasted it too long," he said. She shook her head. "It's good." He smiled at the cup instead of her. "Today, you'll walk the southern ridge. Take the lower trail. Stay close to the stone markers. The map is in the drawer by the sink. Then, come back before the light fades." She nodded. There was nothing else to say. The map was hand-drawn, the kind printed on weather-worn paper with the texture of old linen. A loose line, roughly inked, traced a looping path through elevations marked only with notations like "steep here" and "watch the edge." She folded it carefully and slipped it into the side pouch of her satchel, next to the field notebook. Outside, the heat was already beginning to rise. The kind that pressed softly at first, waiting to see if you'd resist before deciding whether to linger. The trail started behind the well, where the slope dipped gently into a grove of camellias. Mio walked slowly, not out of caution, but because her body hadn't quite caught up to the world yet. The soft crunch of soil and roots underfoot was steadying. Birds moved above, their wings flickering in and out of light like stones skipping across the surface of a lake. At the base of the slope, a small wooden sign leaned sideways against a rock. The words were faded, the paint almost gone. Only the shape of the characters remained, as if the wood itself remembered the strokes. She ran her hand along the grain, then continued. The path narrowed as it wrapped around a bend, and the sound changed. The forest here breathed differently. There was less wind, but more presence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, only waiting. Mio stopped. A single twig, stripped clean of bark, lay across the trail. It was curved unnaturally, almost bent into a question mark. She stepped over it carefully, resisting the urge to look back. She passed through a corridor of alder trees, their trunks white and clean, speckled with lichen the color of smoke. At her feet, thin vines threaded through the undergrowth like veins. Each step left a shallow imprint in the dirt, but nothing held onto her weight. Eventually, the trees gave way to open ground. Not a clearing, just a widening, where the canopy thinned enough to let the light land in full on the rocks. A patch of short grass pushed through the cracks. Here, the heat pulled more strongly, and the insects hummed in layered tones. She sat on a flat stone and removed her notebook. The pencil felt unfamiliar in her hand, as though it had grown heavier overnight. She did not draw. Instead, she listened. There was a rhythm, not of melody or song, but something softer, like the pacing of thought. A rustle in one direction, then another. Something scurried beneath the low brush, paused, then scurried again. A wingbeat punctuated the quiet, followed by the slow creak of a branch shifting under weight. She let her eyes follow the shadows that moved with the wind. She counted 6 kinds of leaf shapes overhead, each trembling at a different pitch. No 2 trees swayed together, but none stood still. She began to sketch, not the trees themselves, but the way the ground bent beneath them. The curves where roots emerged, the hollows where water might collect, the clusters of leaves gathered like careful thoughts. Near midday, she crossed a narrow wooden footbridge slick with moss. Below, the stream moved quickly, breaking itself against stones without apology. She paused to watch it, standing perfectly still. There was no regularity to its motion, no pattern, no rhythm. Just energy, dispersing, reforming, moving forward. A small branch floated past, turning over once before vanishing around a rock. She placed her hand on the railing. The wood was cold and damp. Something sticky clung to the underside, sap, maybe, or resin. She didn't wipe it away. The forest had its textures. They weren't always meant to be cleaned off. Beyond the bridge, the trail bent sharply and climbed again. A cluster of ferns, waist-high and pale green, covered the slope. Some fronds had unfurled fully, others remained curled like sleeping fingers. She crouched to study one. Tiny spores lined the underside, arranged in perfect symmetry. She traced a finger beside them, careful not to touch. These details weren't for handling. They were for being seen. A low voice startled her. "You're early for the mushrooms." Mio turned. The girl stood at the edge of the ferns. A wide straw hat covered most of her face, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. She carried no bag, no tools. Just a coil of rope slung across her chest, and a pair of clippers tied to her belt. Mio recognized her, though they'd only met once. The forest made strong impressions. "Nanami," Mio said. The girl smiled faintly. "You remember. You said the wind writes in the grove." Nanami gave a small shrug. "It does. Today it's quiet." Mio gestured toward the ferns. "What do they write?" "Mostly apologies," Nanami said. "For stepping on them. For cutting them too early. For not coming back." She said it without irony, and Mio didn't laugh. They walked for a time without conversation. Nanami didn't explain where they were going, and Mio didn't ask. They followed a thin trail that looped around a hollow filled with fallen branches. Every so often, Nanami would stop, kneel, and inspect the soil. "There used to be a shrine here," she said at last. "Not for gods. For stones." Mio looked down. Scattered among the leaves were dozens of smooth, round pebbles arranged in no pattern but placed deliberately. Some had moss, others bore faint carvings, lines, spirals, single points. She crouched beside one. "They moved them when the trail was rerouted," Nanami said. "But the stones didn't like it. So they moved back." Mio traced the spiral on the stone's surface with her gaze, not touching. "I think I can hear it," she whispered. Nanami nodded. "Most people don't listen that close." They parted without ceremony. Nanami stepped behind a cluster of evergreens and did not reappear. Mio walked home alone. The forest was louder now, but not in volume. The kind of loudness that fills the edges of your thoughts. The language of rustling bark, snapping twigs, shifting birds, water tapping against itself in rhythmless pulses. When she reached the house, the sun had dropped behind the ridge. Her uncle sat on the porch again, this time sharpening a small blade with long, practiced strokes. He glanced at her but said nothing. She sat beside him. The sharpening stone made a soft rasp, steady and soothing. "I saw the stones," she said. He nodded once. "And Nanami?" "Good." Another rasp. "She doesn't speak unless there's something worth hearing." Mio opened her notebook and began to draw the spiral. That night, her dreams were quiet. No dialogue, no faces, only texture and shape. Bark that crumbled when touched. A leaf trembling in a pool of water. A shadow moving without a source. Somewhere distant, a stone turning slowly in soft earth. She did not wake startled, only aware, and very still. Chapter 3: The Shape of Still Water. The morning rain didn't announce itself. It began with a hush, a soft thickening of the air, as though the trees had lowered their voices. Mio opened her eyes to the sound of water striking water, not thunderous or rhythmic, but scattered, hesitant. Rain tapping gently on leaves, pooling in the crooks of stone, streaming along the eaves in thin rivulets. Her room had dimmed. The light through the shoji was clouded, pale, and motionless. She remained still under the linen blanket, watching the ceiling. The grain of the wood above her looked different in the low light, deeper and more deliberate, like it had been carved rather than grown. There was a scent rising from the walls, aged timber woken by dampness. Outside, the forest breathed slower. By the time she stepped into the hallway, her uncle had already lit the stove. The house carried the scent of miso and root vegetables, and there was a quiet percussive sound from the kitchen, knife against wood, steady, unhurried. She sat at the low table and wrapped her hands around the tea he had left for her. It was darker today, slightly bitter. Something roasted, something with weight. "You'll stay close," he said without looking up. Mio didn't respond right away. She let the warmth of the cup move through her fingers before answering. "All right." He finished slicing and brought the tray of chopped burdock and daikon to the pot. The rain slows everything. Trails get soft. Roots shift. She watched the steam rise around him and said nothing more. Later that morning, she stepped onto the porch with her notebook tucked under her arm and a linen wrap over her shoulders. The rain had softened to a mist by then, but droplets still fell from the higher branches like punctuation marks in air. She didn't walk far. A narrow path beside the house curved toward a shallow ravine where the trees parted just enough to let in a slate-colored light. She followed it without deciding to, led not by destination, but by the small invitations of the world around her, a bend in the moss, a gap between stones, the gentle incline of a slope that had been walked before. She stopped near a stand of bamboo. Not the tall kind that hissed in wind, but a shorter, denser species, their leaves narrow and delicate, their stalks so close they clicked softly against one another like quiet percussion. Beneath them, the soil had darkened to a deep, saturated brown. Water gathered in the shallow impressions made by deer or wild boar, though the prints had long since blurred. She knelt at the edge of a small puddle, no wider than her palm, and stared at her reflection. It didn't look like her. The rain distorted the surface, tiny impacts that fractured her outline, reshaped her mouth, pulled at the corners of her eyes. She leaned closer. The water stilled briefly, and in that moment she saw something beyond the image of herself. The trees above her, inverted and trembling, a single drop falling from a bamboo leaf, the faint movement of a pale insect skimming the surface. She remained crouched there, unmoving. The longer she looked, the more she noticed the shape of leaves floating just beneath the surface, the thin tendrils of root hair spreading into water, the nearly invisible shimmer of motion as a worm curled deeper into the mud. This was not a mirror. It was a window. And the world beyond it was not waiting to be seen, it had always been there. She heard a rustle and rose slowly, wiping her hands on her sleeves. A figure approached from the trees, feet bare, carrying a canvas satchel stained with moss and ink. The girl's gait was sure quiet. She stepped through the wet undergrowth without hesitation, as if the forest had long since memorized her weight. Nanami. She carried herself differently today, less like a wanderer and more like someone fulfilling a purpose. She nodded in greeting, then crouched near a cluster of dark green moss by the water's edge and removed a thin brush from her satchel. "You keep finding me," Mio said, her voice quieter than she intended. Nanami dipped the brush into the puddle. "I don't. The forest does." She began to paint directly onto the smooth surface of a flat stone. No sketch, no hesitation, just lines, quick and assured. Mio stepped closer and saw the faint outline of a leaf appear in brownish ink, its veins drawn with precise, almost calligraphic motion. Nanami added smaller shapes beside it, perhaps buds or seed pods, and then leaned back, letting the image dry in the mist. "You do this often?" Mio asked. "When it rains," Nanami said, returning the brush to her bag. "The water tells me what to draw. I just trace it." Mio crouched beside her. "What happens when it dries?" Nanami tilted her head. "It disappears." "Doesn't that bother you?" "No," she said simply. "Nothing here stays the way you leave it." Mio opened her notebook and began to draw the puddle, not as it was, but how she saw it, the reflection and the distortion, the layering of things above and below, the edges where certainty broke down. She didn't speak again until she was done. They spent the rest of the day walking through low ground, where the rain had settled in shallow pools and turned leaf litter into a soft mosaic of rot and color. Frogs emerged in small groups, quiet but watchful. Every stone was slick. Every fallen branch held weight. Nanami moved ahead at times, marking the edges of the trail with bundles of rice straw tied in small knots around saplings. Mio asked what they were for. "In case I get turned around," she said. "Or in case someone else does." The sky didn't change, but the light shifted. Rain continued in slow, persistent rhythm, soaking into sleeves and fabric until Mio no longer noticed the wetness. Her skin had stopped protesting. Her body had adapted. By the time they reached a shallow rise overlooking the ravine, Nanami stopped and raised her hand. She pointed silently. Below, half concealed by shrubs and the slant of the earth, stood a single torii gate, no shrine behind it, no platform or offering table. Just the gate itself, worn smooth by time and moisture, its surface dark with moss, its base sunken slightly into the slope. Mio stepped closer. A length of string hung from the horizontal beam, bearing a series of tiny paper charms. Most were faded. Some had been reduced to soft pulp. Only one remained intact, curling slightly at the edges. She reached up and touched it. It held no writing. Only a single pressed flower, delicate and pale, laminated between two squares of washi. The petals were translucent, their color long since drained. "Why is this still here?" she asked. Nanami's reply came after a pause. "Some promises wait longer than others." That evening, Mio returned home soaked to the knees, her notebook full of drawings and her hands streaked with earth. Her uncle didn't comment on the state of her clothes. He handed her a towel and set a bowl of hot soup beside the fire pit. Later, after she had dried off and changed, she opened the notebook on her futon and stared at the page with the puddle drawing. The lines had blurred slightly from the damp. A section near the center had faded entirely. She traced it with her fingertip. The reflection, the distortion, the insect, the drop gone. Only the outline of her own handprint remained faintly along the margin, the result of pressing against the paper without meaning to. She left it there. Outside, the rain lightened. A breeze stirred through the leaves with a sound like pages turning underwater. And Mio, resting in her corner of the house beneath the slope and the trees and the watchful quiet of the forest, did not sleep with dreams or questions. Only stillness. Chapter 4: Beneath the Stone and Root. The air changed before the sky did. It began with a stillness so dense that even the trees refused to move. Not a bird called, not a leaf turned. The cicadas, normally shrill and ever-present, had vanished without ceremony. Mio noticed it as she stood barefoot in the garden, basket in hand, stooping to gather wild shiso that had crept into the path near the well. She straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her palm. The silence wasn't hollow. It was saturated. She glanced toward the forest's edge. The branches were too still, too poised as though bracing. The clouds above hadn't darkened, not in the usual way. They hovered pale and heavy like stones sunk just beneath the surface of a clear stream. Her uncle stepped out onto the porch, drying his hands on a cloth. "Put that down," he said gently. "We'll gather later." Mio followed him inside without protest. He left the doors open, as always, and began to stack cushions and close drawers, not in panic, but in habit. She didn't ask what for. Her stomach had already tightened around a sensation she couldn't name. Then the first tremor rolled through. It was subtle, a long breath drawn by the earth beneath them, barely perceptible beneath the hush. A few bowls on the shelf shifted, one rattling faintly before resettling. The floor creaked in protest. Then it passed. "That wasn't it," her uncle said quietly. He reached for a lacquered box above the stove and retrieved a narrow cylinder, a candle, thick and unfinished, with twine still wrapped at its base. He lit it and placed it at the center of the table, though the daylight still poured in. The second tremor came with sound. A dull roar, distant but vast, as if a mountainside had shifted in its sleep. The ground didn't shake, it rolled, a motion that came from below the spine, not beneath the feet. The walls moaned once, deep and wooden, and a vase tipped over in the hall, scattering stems across the floor. Still, nothing fell. The forest held. Then, silence returned. Mio realized she'd been gripping the edge of the table. Her knuckles ached. Her uncle poured tea without looking at her, his movements slow and precise, like a ritual designed to steady more than hands. "That's the end of it," he said. But Mio wasn't sure he meant the quake. When she ventured outside again, it was late afternoon and the light had changed. The sun pressed through the canopy with the weight of something recently remembered. The moss on the stones shimmered with a finer grain, the path wet in places where no rain had fallen. She walked past the garden and down the slope, toward the river's edge, where stones rested like old thoughts beside the current. The water was faster now, just slightly, as though disturbed far upstream. As she reached the bend, she found the fallen camphor. It hadn't snapped, it had sunk, roots torn in slow agony from the soil, its trunk leaning into the slope like a body too weary to rise. The bark was unbroken. Its leaves were still alive. But it was no longer standing. Mio approached slowly. She had seen trees fall before, in storms or in human-cleared fields, but this felt different. This tree had endured, not fallen. There was no drama in its collapse, only exhaustion. She placed a hand on its side. It was warm. Beneath her fingers, the surface trembled, not with life, but memory. The rings inside this tree had held entire seasons, the shape of winds, the taste of fog. And now it lay horizontal, caught between living and decay. She heard a step behind her and turned. Nanami stood at the trail's edge, her satchel gone, sleeves rolled, palms stained with soil. "I thought I might find you here," she said. Mio gestured to the tree, words catching. "It didn't break." "No," Nanami said. "It gave in." She stepped forward and knelt beside the exposed roots. Her fingers moved with care, brushing dirt from the tendrils as though they were woven silk. "I've only seen one fall like this before," she said. "Years ago. Same curve in the land. Same kind of stillness before." "Is it dying?" Mio asked. Nanami paused, then shook her head. "No, but it's no longer what it was." They spent the next hour in silence, gathering the smaller branches from around the trunk and placing them in a careful pile. Nanami pulled a flake of bark free and turned it over in her hand, revealing a maze of patterns etched by beetles that had once lived beneath. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, offering it. Mio looked closer. "A tunnel." "A story," Nanami said. "Every turn, every interruption, is a choice. They leave their whole lives behind, carved into something they never meant to shape." Mio took the bark and slipped it into her notebook. She didn't draw it. She didn't need to. The grooves were already etched into her thoughts. When they returned to the house, the candle on the table had burned halfway down. Her uncle was still seated, now writing slowly into a bound book she hadn't seen before. Not the journal with leaves and sketches, but something thicker, older. The pages were cloth-bound, the ink dark as bark. He looked up and gestured for her to sit. "Do you know what lies beneath this house?" he asked. She shook her head. "Stone. Deep ones. Rootlocked and unmoved since before the shrine was built. They don't shift. That's why the house didn't either." He turned a page, then continued. "But sometimes, when things do move, it's not to destroy. It's to realign." Mio thought of the tree. He handed her a folded square of paper. It was rough, heavy, and hand-dyed a faded green. On it was a map, not one with roads or paths, but markers, tree glyphs, stones drawn with ridges, the arc of a dry creek bed. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll walk this." She looked at him, uncertain. "Alone?" "Yes." Her heartbeat picked up. Not with fear, something more electric. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because the forest has watched you long enough. It's time you started listening back." That night, sleep didn't arrive easily. The forest outside was alive with post-quake breath. Owls called in ways she hadn't heard before, less as warnings, more as signals. The river had thickened in voice. Even the wind had adopted a new path, curling against the window frame like it was tracing an unfamiliar pattern. Mio lay with her map unfolded beside her. She touched the drawn lines with her fingertip, trying to understand what they represented. Not distance, not direction, but intention. A walk through meaning, not through space. She lit the last of the candle and stared into its flame until her eyes began to close. And when she finally did sleep, her dreams were not of trees or falling. They were of soundless movement, of shifting beneath roots, of something ancient rearranging itself just enough to make room for her. Chapter 5, Where the Wind Remembers. The morning light had changed. It didn't press through the trees in golden columns, as it once had. Now it poured in thin and silver, casting the world in a hush so complete that even the birdsong seemed reluctant to rise. Mio stood at the threshold with her boots laced, her satchel light but full. In her hands, the map her uncle had given her had softened from study, its edges worn and corners curled slightly from nights of being unfolded, refolded, and traced. She didn't understand all of its symbols, curved arrows like spirals, a line of dots that cut across nothing, a drawn eye nestled between two stones, but she knew them by feel now. Their mystery didn't threaten her. It guided her. Her uncle appeared behind her, hands dry and empty. No parting words. No reminders. Only a nod. Mio stepped off the porch. The path began as one she had taken before, familiar moss underfoot, the wooden footbridge that groaned softly under weight, the water flowing beneath it with its usual low rhythm. But just past the third cedar tree, where she would normally veer left toward the river, she turned right. There was no trail, only suggestion. Pine needles had blanketed the slope, and the earth beneath them yielded in a different way with each step, as if gauging her intent. Ferns brushed against her calves. The air was cooler here, denser, carrying the scent of whetstone and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. She paused once at the base of a large boulder marked with lichen. The map called it Shifting Silence, and Mio understood why. The moment she stepped into its shadow, every sound vanished: the forest's breath, the insect hum, the far-off bird calls. All gone. Even her footsteps ceased to echo. She lingered only long enough to feel the absence in her chest, then moved on, her pulse louder in her ears than the world around her. Midway through the day, she reached a place where the trees thinned, and the light fell freely across a wide basin lined with grasses and wildflowers that moved as if they were underwater. In the center sat a wind bell. A single one. Hung from a narrow wooden frame, weathered but standing. Mio stepped toward it, wary. It was untouched by rust. Its ribbon fluttered, blue and long, though there was no wind. She reached out and brushed her fingers against the bell. It didn't ring. Instead, the air shifted. Not a breeze, not a gust, but the pattern of the air, as if the forest had adjusted its breathing to accommodate her presence. And then she heard it, not from the bell, but from within her. A sound like remembered laughter, echoing through bamboo. It passed in a blink. Not a hallucination. Not a memory. Something else. Mio stepped back, breath unsteady. She looked around. Nothing moved. Yet everything felt watched. Not by danger.by recognition. She continued deeper. Roots grew stranger here, some curling upward as if reaching for sky, others splitting in patterns too deliberate to be accidents. At one point, the trail passed beneath a natural arch formed by two leaning trees, their branches braided together by vines. Mio hesitated, then ducked beneath it. The map called this crossing the mouth of the listening ones. She didn't ask why, but after she passed beneath, she began to hear things differently. Not voices, not words, but rhythm. Each step she took landed in time with something greater. Her breath matched the cadence of wind pushing through the canopy. A crow's call arrived exactly as she exhaled. Leaves tumbled in spirals that mirrored her own stillness when she paused. The world wasn't speaking to her. It was responding. By late afternoon, the sky had cooled, casting long shadows that moved like animals across the forest floor. Mio followed the final symbol on the map, a swirl that wrapped around a solid circle, until she reached it, a shallow hollow surrounded by stone. It wasn't a shrine.it, wasn't a monument.it, was a seat, worn directly into the earth. There were no carvings, no steps, just a depression, perfectly rounded, ringed by upright stones that glowed faintly with lichen. Mio stepped into it. Saturday. And everything fell still. Birds did not fly overhead. The breeze died. The insects vanished. Even her own heartbeat quieted. In that stillness, something beneath her stirred. Not movement. Not sound. A pressure, like hands beneath water, or a breath held just beneath the surface of the soil. And then, as if a page had been turned without her noticing, a memory bloomed. But it wasn't hers. She saw a girl, not herself, walking barefoot through the trees. Her hair was longer, her robe simpler, but her eyes held the same searching shape. The girl knelt in this same spot, laid a bundle of cloth on the earth, whispered into the ground. Mio heard only the final word. Stay. Then it vanished. She blinked, throat dry, palms open. The stones around her no longer felt cold. They hummed faintly, like the rim of a bowl struck by a soft hand. She stood. The map had no more markings. No trail back. But Mio no longer needed one. When she returned to the house, dusk was turning the forest pink. Her uncle was waiting on the porch, tea already cooling beside him. He looked up, expression unreadable. Well, Mio sat beside him. She said nothing, only reached into her satchel and placed the wind bell's ribbon on the table. It had detached sometime during her return. She hadn't noticed when. The ribbon no longer fluttered, but it shimmered faintly as if still touched by wind no longer present. Her uncle nodded, very slightly. Then it's begun. That night, Mio did not sleep in her room. She stepped outside after the candles were out and walked barefoot into the garden, then down the mossy path, stopping near the river's bend. The stars had returned. Not in clusters, but scattered across the sky like seeds waiting to take root. She sat on a stone still warm from sun, closed her eyes, and listened. The forest did not speak, but it remembered. And in that remembering, Mio heard something she had not yet been taught, a language without words, a story without time, a promise written not in ink but in the spaces between all things. Chapter 6: The Bone of the Mountain. It had rained in the night. Not loudly, not with thunder or fanfare, but with a hush so continuous that Mio dreamed of distant waves sweeping across an unseen shore. When she woke, her blanket clung to her skin with the faint scent of cedar, and the world beyond the window had turned glass-soft, veiled by mist, luminous at the edges. Outside, the forest held stillness not as absence, but as presence. She stepped barefoot onto the veranda, steam rising from her tea. The fog was thick, but not oppressive. It didn't hide the forest so much as soften it, blurring the hard lines, silencing the sharpness of distance. It was a kind of mercy, the way it invited only the near and left the rest to memory. Behind her, her uncle was carving again, not something small and familiar, but a long piece of cedar drawn from beneath the porch. It stretched the length of the room. He hadn't said what it was for, and Mio didn't ask. Some things speak clearer when unnamed. That afternoon, Nanami appeared with 2 cloaks and a quiet look. "We're going up today," she said. Mio had known this was coming. The mountain to the north, Kuroyama, had loomed in her periphery since the day she arrived. Not for its size, which was unremarkable, but for the way it refused to be seen. From every window in the house, it was obscured by trees, by the angle of the land, by well-placed stones. Even on clear days, clouds gathered around it as if shielding its summit from knowing eyes. They didn't take the road. Nanami led her along a narrow trail that wrapped through switchbacks so old that they had sunken into the mountain skin. Roots had grown across the stones like veins. Small bones lined some of the bends not as warnings, but as offerings. Birds did not follow them. The air thinned with every step, not from lack of oxygen, but from stillness, the kind that came from above, pressing down. "Have you climbed this before?" Mio asked, breath misting. "Only twice," Nanami said. "Once as a child. Once when I forgot how to listen." They didn't speak again for a long while. Higher still, the trail narrowed between 2 large stone faces. They weren't carved, but bore natural indentations, rivulets formed by rain and moss, and the brushing of antlers or claws over decades. Between them, the trees changed. No longer cedar or pine, but something more stubborn, oak with limbs like grasping arms, maple knotted like fists. A few trees were stripped of bark entirely, their skinless trunks pale and raw as healed scars. At the final rise, the forest fell away, and the stone trail opened into a clearing shaped like a bowl. It was silent, but not empty. At its center stood a single stone pillar, fractured at the top, barely taller than Mio. It looked like a broken tusk, half buried in the mountain's flank. Around it were rings of footprints, none recent, but preserved by the shape of the land, as though the ground had chosen to hold them. Nanami knelt. Mio followed. They sat without words. For nearly an hour, they remained there, unmoving. Not in meditation, not in prayer, but in reception, as though waiting for something to rise. And finally, it did. The sound came not from around them, but beneath. A low, slow exhale, not breath, not wind, memory. The mountain was remembering something in their presence. not a moment. A presence. Mio's vision blurred, not with tears, but with a heat behind her eyes, like sunburnt snow. The stone before her began to flicker, not with light, but with image. Not projected, not literal, but understood. A creature. Vast. Antlered. Its body made of stone and bark and storm, its eyes shaped like empty sky. It stood where they sat. It was the mountain. Or once had been. It looked down at her, not with threat, not even with curiosity, but with recognition, as if it had known her shape long before she took it. Then it vanished. No farewell, no explosion, no cry, only stillness. Nanami stood, dusted her knees. "We come here not to remember," she said, voice softer than wind, but to be remembered. Mio looked at the broken stone. "Is it gone?" "No," Nanami said. "It changed shape." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. That evening, as they descended the mountain, the fog returned, not heavy, but generous, letting the weight of what they'd witnessed settle gently across their shoulders. When they reached the house, the cedar carving was gone. In its place stood a frame above the garden path, simple, arched, and clean. Not a torii, not a gate, a threshold. Her uncle stood beside it, hands stained with sap. He looked at Mio, not with pride, not with permission, with clarity. "It recognized you," he said. Mio stepped beneath the frame. The wind shifted. Something passed through her, not wind, not breath, not spirit, but space. And she understood. This forest no longer made room for her. It had opened a place because she belonged. That night, she dreamed again. Not of stone or storm or shadow, but of her own voice, speaking a name she did not know, to a creature made of trees and sky and silence. And in the dream, it answered not with sound, but by kneeling. Chapter 7: The Names Beneath the Bark. The days had begun to fold into one another, not in monotony, but in rhythm, like the creases of a leaf, each separate, but part of the same living shape. Mio no longer marked time by meals or sunrises, but by sensation, the texture of fog against her fingertips, the tone of the birdsong outside her window, the scent of crushed pine when she walked the morning path. Something had changed since the mountain, something quiet, but complete. She could feel it not just in herself, but in the way the world around her moved in return. It wasn't magic. Not in the way stories often told. It was attention. And attention, when practiced long enough, begins to shape the one who listens. It was Nanami who brought her to the hollow. "You've been felt," she said plainly, offering Mio a short walking stick carved with shallow grooves. "Now you should begin to feel back." They followed a path she hadn't seen before, half hidden behind a thicket of birch and low briar, where the air hung a little lower, a little warmer. There were no birds here, no wind, only the sound of dripping, a steady, arrhythmic tapping, as though the forest was ticking off thoughts it couldn't quite finish. The trees here were older, thicker. Their bark curled and split like aged parchment, and their roots lifted high above the ground, weaving together like knotted ropes. Mio felt watched, not by eyes, but by presence. The kind that didn't peer down but sat alongside. Nanami stopped beside a tree twice their height, its base split by a natural groove. "Sit here," she said. Mio did. Nanami handed her a strip of thin, folded parchment. "Write down the name of something you've never said aloud." Mio blinked. "A secret?" "No. A name," Nanami replied. "It doesn't have to be human." Mio stared at the paper. The bark behind her was rough, patient. She closed her eyes. Something surfaced, not from memory, not from language, but from some deeper place. When she opened her eyes again, her hand was already moving. Siln. She didn't know what it meant. Only that it had always existed behind her ribs, like a small stone tucked in a pocket she hadn't realized was hers. Nanami took the paper gently, rolled it, and slid it into a hollow near the base of the tree. "Now you'll listen for it." They returned to the house in near silence. Mio felt as though she'd been asked a question and had answered correctly, though she didn't know the shape of the test. That night, the dream came differently. No forest, no creature, no voices. Only light, not bright, warm, pulsing like the glow of embers. And within it, the shape of a hand, reaching not to her, but from her. Over the next days, the rhythm shifted again. The forest brought her small offerings. A single feather, balanced upright on a bed of moss. A stone, carved faintly with a spiral she hadn't seen before. A branch that fell at her feet during a windless hour, its break too clean to be accident. Each time she found one, she said nothing. She only placed it in the corner of her room beneath the window, where light pooled in the mornings. Her uncle never asked. Nanami only smiled. One morning, she awoke to find the stone was missing. In its place, a folded paper. Inside, written in unfamiliar ink, was the word Siln. The name she had given. Returned to her. That evening, her uncle finally spoke of it. "You've been marked," he said, not unkindly. "Not claimed. There's a difference." Mio looked up from the ribbon she was rebraiding. "What does it want?" "It doesn't want," he replied. "It recognizes." She thought of the way her name had come back to her. Not echoed. Not spoken. Affirmed. "Do you have one?" she asked. "A name," he smiled. "Dozens. But only one the forest remembers." He didn't share it. She didn't ask. The hollow became a part of her days. She returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Nanami. Each time, she sat with a new piece of parchment. Each time, a new name came. Some were clear. Varel, Anen, they. Others were stranger, as though borrowed from a different alphabet that only her body remembered. So, Lyran.uv. Each was placed within the tree. None ever reappeared. Until one morning, she awoke to find a whisper scrawled across her window, drawn in the condensation of her breath. UV is listening. She didn't know whether to feel comforted or unnerved. She chose to feel both. Later that week, a rainstorm rolled in. Not fierce, just long. The sky wept for nearly 2 full days, drawing the earth into itself. Trees wept slowly, their trunks darkening, moss glowing brighter against the sodden ground. On the second morning, Mio woke to find her satchel packed. Her uncle stood by the door. "Follow the river today," he said. "The one that forks." She took the satchel without question. At the fork, she turned left, into a part of the forest she hadn't yet touched. The trees grew taller here, but thinner, reaching straight toward the sky as if they had something to prove. The ground was slick. The river's voice grew louder, not from volume, but from intention. It wasn't rushing. It was speaking. Eventually, the forest opened into a clearing of stone. Moss-covered slabs arranged in a ring, open to the sky, where the rain fell gently and evenly as if measured by unseen hands. In the center was a single figure. Not human, not beast. Carved of wood so old it had turned to stone in places, its back hunched, arms long and root-like, its head bowed, not in shame, but in listening. Mio approached slowly. At its feet was a small indentation, like a basin. Inside it, water, still and dark. And floating within, a strip of parchment. She leaned in. It read, "Lyran remembers." When she returned home, soaked to the knees, her uncle opened the door before she knocked. He handed her a dry towel and said only one thing. "You're beginning to be known." That night, the wind returned. It did not moan. It did not howl. It breathed, evenly and close, as if through the mouth of someone resting beside her. Mio lay awake for hours, eyes open, listening. Not for words, not for names, but for the space between them. And it was there, in that space, that she finally understood. Names did not summon. They remembered. Chapter 8, Where the River Hides Its Mouth. The morning light had grown gold-heavy, slanting in low and rich through the canopy, as though the sun itself had thickened. It warmed the dew on the cedar needles until they shimmered like threads drawn across the fabric of some dream-soaked tapestry. The air had weight to it now, not heat, but memory. The kind that sat just behind the lungs, unshaped but undeniable. Mia woke already knowing she would not return before nightfall. Her satchel was packed without thought. Her boots were laced with careful hands. Her fingers brushed the carved groove of her walking stick, and something in the air around her skin seemed to shift, not sharply, but like a cat lifting its head at a familiar scent. Even her uncle said nothing that morning, just nodded once, handed her a warm rice bun wrapped in folded cloth, and turned back to his work, as if she were simply stepping outside to fetch water. But they both knew the forest had asked something of her. She began by tracing the stream behind the house, not the river, not the thick path of current that carved east through the mountains, but the slender thread that whispered behind the garden and disappeared beneath a tangle of stones. Nanami had once called it the root vein, a name Mio had only half understood. It had rained the night before. The stream was fuller now, clearer, and the pebbles beneath its skin gleamed like ink-polished teeth. As she followed its edge, the forest began to change, not in form, but in behavior. Trees stood straighter, but more closely gathered. The moss underfoot grew brighter, almost phosphorescent in the shadows. Branches no longer bent toward the light, they pointed, subtly, toward the water's flow. At a bend in the stream, the path vanished. But Mio continued on. She found the first of them in the early afternoon, a cluster of stones stacked without balance, balanced without logic. Each one thin, slate gray, and scored with faint circular markings. At first glance, meaningless. But as she circled the tower, the marks began to align, not into writing, not into image, but into motion. The stone said, "Not all mouths open with sound." The stream passed beneath it, then vanished into the roots of a fallen cedar. She knelt beside it, pressed her palm to the wet earth, and waited. The silence here wasn't hollow. It was expectant. And it made her realize something. This wasn't a path she'd chosen. It was a summons. By late afternoon, the trees thinned, and the forest floor fell away into a wide, flat basin, shaped like the open palm of a giant hand. In its center, the stream ended not in a pond, not in a pool, but in a mouth. Not a creature's mouth. Not a cave. A place where the water simply disappeared. There were no stones, no reeds. No birds flew overhead. No breeze moved the branches. Just the hush of water vanishing. She knelt beside it, stared down into the darkness, and waited. The first thing she felt was cold. Not physical chill, but recognition, a brushing against the part of herself that remembered walking into the mountain and meeting the gaze of something so vast it could only speak in silence. Then the voice came. Not out loud, not in her ears, but behind her heart. "You've named the listening, now you will name the forgetting." She didn't speak, didn't move, only breathed. "The river keeps what cannot be said. You have heard, you will unhear." Then silence. But it was different now. Fuller. Alive. Mio stood. She reached into her satchel and removed the last piece of parchment she had brought. But this time, she didn't write on it. Instead, she whispered to it. Not a name. Not a word. Just breath. And when she dropped it into the river's mouth, it sank without a trace. The walk home was longer. Time thickened. The light changed twice. Once into the soft bruising of dusk, and then again into the blue quiet of night. She didn't light a lantern. The path seemed to know her feet. When she reached the house, the front gate was ajar. The garden shimmered with dew, though no rain had fallen since she left. Her uncle was waiting at the threshold. "She took you to the river," he said. Mio nodded. He looked at her not with worry, but with a kind of gentleness she hadn't seen in his face until now. "She's asking more of you." Mio stepped inside. "Then I'll give more." That night, her dreams were strange. Not frightening, not peaceful. She was standing in a place without light or air or form, but not alone. There were voices not around her, but inside, whispering things she could not translate. Fragments of other names. Names she had not given, but recognized. Names that lived under the bark, under the bones of the trees, under her skin. When she woke, there were no words in her mouth, only the taste of the stream, and the memory of a silence so complete it felt like belonging. Chapter 9: The Hours That Hide in Trees. The fog returned just before dawn. Not a heavy one, but close. It curled low along the floorboards, crept beneath the shutters, and pressed soft fingers against the window panes like something asking to be let in. The forest outside blurred into an impressionist smear of color and movement: blue-shadowed trunks, the red flare of a fox's tail, the slow rise of steam from the moss. Even the birds, usually so quick to sing the sun awake, stayed quiet. Mio did not rise immediately. She sat in her bed, covers tucked beneath her chin, and watched the haze swirl. It reminded her of breath on cold glass, of memories not quite remembered. Eventually, she dressed and stepped barefoot onto the wooden floor. Her boots remained by the door. Today did not require them. Nanami met her at the edge of the field, just where the garden gave way to forest. She wore no cloak, no bag, only a strip of bark tied around one wrist, carved with lines so fine they seemed to shimmer when the light struck them just right. "You've walked the rivers," Nanami said. "Now walk the hours." Mio tilted her head. "What are the hours?" Nanami smiled. "Not when. Where?" And then she turned and walked into the fog. They passed no markers, no familiar stones. Only trees. But Mio quickly noticed something peculiar. These trees were not the same. Their bark was darker, less rough. Their leaves hung motionless despite the faint current of air. And their roots did not sprawl outward, but sank straight into the ground, as if pinned. The air grew denser. The fog thickened. Not with moisture, but with stillness. Then, just as Mio felt they had walked far too long in silence, the trees changed again. They stood in a grove unlike any she'd seen: tall, narrow trees with smooth, gray bark that gleamed like worn pewter. No undergrowth. No birds. And between each trunk, a single ribbon, tied loosely, fluttering without wind. Nanami gestured. "This is where they linger." "Who?" "The hours." Mio stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the soft moss within the grove, something shifted. The light deepened. Not dimmed, deepened. Shadows stretched sideways. Her breath caught in her throat, then released, slower. Her heart slowed. Her thoughts slowed. Nanami stood at the edge. "Choose one." Mio walked slowly through the grove. The ribbons were old, some frayed, some nearly faded. Each seemed to hum a little, as though woven from breath. She paused before one that hung particularly still. Pale gold, with a single word inked faintly in the middle. "Sillin." She touched it. The world turned. She stood on a narrow hilltop, grass brushing her knees. The sky was vast, amber-gray, cloudless. The forest was gone. Below her stretched a plain, and on it, a single cottage with a crooked chimney and windows glowing warm against the strange sky. Inside, she could see shapes moving. A girl. A man. Laughter. Bread passed between hands. Steam curling from tea. It took her a long moment to realize the girl was herself. Not as she was. As she might have been. In another hour. The vision didn't ache. It didn't burn. It simply was. And then it vanished. Back in the grove, Mio stumbled. Nanami caught her wrist. "Careful," she whispered. "Each hour has its weight." Mio looked back at the ribbon. It no longer fluttered. It hung limp. Nanami guided her out. As they walked, Mio whispered, "Are they futures?" Nanami shook her head. "They are could-have-beens. Moments left behind by others. Or by ourselves. The forest keeps them." Mio shivered. "Why show me?" "Because you are nearing the center," Nanami said. "And the center has no path. Only memory. And forgetting." The rest of the day passed in a hush. Mio returned home, her boots damp from moss. Her uncle said nothing, only poured her tea and placed a small bundle on the table beside her: rosemary, mountain pear, and a strip of bark tied with gold thread. She understood. That night, she wrote a name on a new piece of parchment. But instead of placing it by the window, she pressed it into the soil beneath the cedar just beyond the porch. In the morning, it was gone. In its place, a ribbon. Soft gold. Blink. Waiting. Chapter 10: The Name Beneath the Stones. Rain fell without sound. It moved like breath against the canopy, beating on the leaves and slipping down their spines in single droplets. Not a storm, not even a proper drizzle. Just the slow, patient descent of water through layers of forest that had long since grown used to being listened to. Mio watched it from the threshold of the porch. She had not spoken since sunrise. Neither had her uncle. Words lately had begun to feel like echoes, useful only when one had something to return to. She stepped out barefoot. The wood was cool underfoot, rain-slick and worn smooth by time. Her uncle did not look up from the blade he was sharpening. She said, quietly, "Today I go to the hollow." He nodded. "Do not enter it lightly." The path there was one the forest had not offered before. It revealed itself gradually, a narrowing of the undergrowth, a thinning of brambles, the slow incline of the land like a breath being held. Mio walked without a stick today, her satchel carrying only a single candle wrapped in waxcloth, a piece of chalk, and the ribbon from the cedar. The hollow was not a place. It was a space. A basin deep in the forest, round as a bowl and ringed by stones the size of benches. Trees arched inward at its rim, but did not cross into the circle. No leaves scattered its floor. No birds passed overhead. Even the rain, so steady before, ceased its falling here. It was the kind of quiet that did not invite, but expect. Mio stepped into it. Her breath caught. Not in fear. In recognition. At the center of the hollow lay a single flat stone, no taller than her knee, pale as ash. Upon it, faint carvings barely visible, scratches, not script. Spirals that looped in on themselves and stopped just short of forming something legible. Mio knelt. She placed the ribbon on the stone. Nothing happened. She lit the candle. Still, the hollow waited. Finally, she took the chalk and, with a hand she barely felt as her own, traced one of the spiral carvings until it closed. The wind dropped. Then rose. From below. The earth did not tremble. It exhaled. A deep, slow sigh of dry air, ancient and still scented faintly with roots, fungus, and something metallic beneath. The candle did not flicker. Mio stood. She understood. This was not a place for speech. This was where a name waited to be unburied. She began to circle the hollow, slowly, eyes cast down. Each stone at the edge bore a mark, some familiar, some not. But as she walked, she began to see something she hadn't before: faint trails of pigment under the moss. Faded colors. Paint, or perhaps lichen that had been shaped long ago. They weren't random. They were directions. And when she followed them, the spirals beneath the moss connected into a single shape. A character. A sigil. A name. Not hers. But one she knew. Not from language. From feeling. She spoke it aloud. The candle extinguished. She opened her eyes to darkness. Not night. Not blindness. Darkness as place. Shapes began to form. A low ceiling of roots. Stone walls, curved like a nest. She stood underground, beneath the hollow. The forest above was silent. And before her, a figure. Not human. Not spirit. Something between. Its body was made of bark and smoke. Its face a hollow impression. But its presence was not menacing. It watched her as one might watch an old song being hummed again after silence. It spoke. Not aloud, but with place. "You have named the unseen." Mio bowed her head. "You are not a keeper. You are not a carrier. You are not a caller." She raised her eyes. "Then what am I?" A becoming. It stepped back. The walls of the chamber began to glow faintly with phosphorescent lines, the same spirals, but now complete. Take one. Not to carry. To remember. Mio reached forward, and from the wall peeled a thin stone disc, no larger than her palm. It was warm. When she held it, her name, rose faintly to her mind. Not the one given at birth. The one the forest had always whispered. Mio. The spiral shifted. Mio. Me. Echo.o hollow. Together, the sound made when a hollow sings. She rose to the surface as if waking. The candle was still there, cold. The ribbon had turned pale gray. Her satchel was untouched. But the hollow was no longer silent. A soft hum filled it. Not music. Not voice. Recognition. She stepped outside the circle. Rain resumed. At home, her uncle met her at the door. He looked at her hands, saw the stone, and nodded. You heard it. I became it, she said. He did not ask more. That night, the dreams returned. But this time, the voices did not whisper. They sang. Chapter 11, The Shape of Silence. No birds sang the morning Mio awoke with moss on her fingertips. It hadn't been there when she went to sleep. Her hands had been clean, wrapped in linen, still stained faintly with the ash of last night's fire. But now the green tufts curled gently beneath her fingernails, damp with dew, as though she had spent the night burrowed beneath the forest floor rather than within the wooden warmth of her uncle's home. She did not panic. The forest was no longer outside her, and she was no longer merely within it. The day began without instruction. No letter on the sill. No new path carved through the bracken. Not even a glance from her uncle, who had risen before the light and now knelt in the garden, his hands deep in soil, face unreadable. Mio drank the last of the rainwater from the cedar bowl and stepped out. The air had weight to it, not heat, not humidity, but a density of attention, as though every tree had turned slightly to watch her pass. She walked north, where the old growth thickened and the land lifted into long, low ridges crowned with ferns. The earth here was darker, riddled with roots and silent channels of insects and shadow. By midday she reached the grove where names had once flickered through ribbon. It was empty now. No wind. No movement. Only the feeling of presence. Mio sat at the base of the tallest tree and pressed her palm to the ground. Not seeking. Not calling. Simply being. It began slowly. The warmth in her spine. The soft tightening behind her eyes. The shift in her breathing, not shorter, not faster, but fuller. Then, the silence. Not the absence of sound. The shape of silence. It uncurled around her like a second skin, wrapping itself across the grove until even the usual murmur of leaves and insects fell away. The stillness did not smother, it clarified. It peeled away the noise of the world until only essential things remained. A single branch cracked in the distance. Then another. Then none. Mio opened her eyes to dusk. The forest had changed. Not in shape, but in presence. Everything had drawn closer. Not physically, but consciously. The trees no longer watched. They listened. She stood, and her foot sank slightly into the soil. It had softened. Or she had. Her steps left no trail. As she moved deeper into the grove, the air shifted from shadow to pale blue glow, cast by a series of bioluminescent fungi that had emerged along the roots. They were not there before. They pulsed faintly in rhythm with her own breath. She followed the pattern. It led her to a clearing where a single object waited, a bowl of stone, shallow and worn, carved with a spiral she had not seen before. It was filled with water clear as glass, but its surface did not reflect. Mio knelt. She did not speak. She touched the water. The liquid rippled once, then stilled, then opened. Not in a splash or swirl, it simply parted, like a breath being drawn inward. Below it, light. Not white. Not color. Something before color. Mio leaned closer. She saw a tree. Not a tree she had met. Not one in any forest she knew. It stood in a space without horizon, roots stretching into mist, branches reaching into darkness. She saw a figure at its base. Herself. But older. Tired. Holding something. Not a book. Not a blade. A name. Cradled like a child. She pulled back. The water closed. The bowl faded into the ground like it had never been there. Above her, a soft sound began. A hum. Not a voice. Of Canopy. Leaves vibrating not in wind, but in harmony. The sound pressed gently at the edges of her mind, not forcing its way in, but inviting her to remember something she hadn't learned yet. She sat again. Waited. Listened. And in the stillness, the silence returned. Only now it had a shape. And that shape was her own. When Mio returned home, the lamps were lit. Her uncle waited by the hearth, a cup of something warm in his hands. He did not rise, did not speak. But beside him on the table sat a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it gently. A carving knife. A blank piece of bark. A single dried flower. No note. She placed them on her windowsill, where the light from the fire touched them. Then she lay down. Sleep did not come quickly. But when it did, it smelled of moss. And sounded like listening. Chapter 12, The Wintering Names. The frost arrived before the season. Not in force, not in the crackle of ice across the trees, but in the hush that came with the change of air. The mornings grew heavy with silence, and the light, when it came, slanted through the branches with a weight it had not carried before. Mio felt it first in her breath, slower, deeper, drawn like a draught from a well rather than a sip from spring. She stood beneath the cedar tree with her hands bare. The ribbon had turned stiff in the cold. The bark held less scent. But the memories still clung to it like resin. Not of moments. Of meanings. The kind that linger long after words have frayed. There were fewer dreams now and more awakenings in darkness. The forest was shifting again. Not with violence. With gravity. Each morning, Mio found something new pressed against the edge of her waking. A fern curled inward, shaped like a question. A feather the color of ash. A stone in the shape of a door. They left her room as they had arrived, without sound, without claim. Only her uncle seemed unchanged. He rose early. Boiled roots. Repaired tools. Sometimes he... But when Mio sat beside him, he always gave her half the seat. That was enough. The forest called less often. But when it did, the calls were longer. This time, she walked past the hollow, past the spiral stones, into a stretch of woodland she did not know by path, but by scent. It smelled of rain not yet fallen. There, beneath the twisted oak, she found a ring of bones. Small. Bird-like. Arranged with care. Not warning. Remembrance. Mio sat and watched the bones until the light shifted. Until their shape became clear. They mirrored a constellation. One that never appeared above her home. One she remembered only from a dream. She marked it into the soil. Not to keep. To return. That night, her uncle left a folded piece of bark on her pillow. It held a single word, etched in his hand. Winter. She carried it to the cedar and placed it beneath the roots. The ground was not yet frozen, but it held a hardness she had not known before. The roots flexed slightly beneath her fingers, like a sleeper stirred from dreaming. A wind moved through the branches above. Not cold. Just true. Mio spent the next day carving. Not symbols. Not stories. She carved spaces. Empty forms into soft wood, hollows into bark, curves into clay that could hold something unnamed. She did not know what they were for. But they felt necessary. By evening, she had shaped 7. She placed them at the windowsill. The wind did not move them. But something within her shifted. A readiness. On the 7th night, the stars changed. Not all at once. Not obviously. But Mio, standing outside with her hands in the pockets of her old coat, saw it. One star had dimmed. Another blinked back. And between them, a silence. She named it. Not aloud, but within. It felt like placing a stone at the center of her ribs. Wait. Meaning. Stillness. The next morning, the ribbon was gone. In its place, a single pine needle, bound with thread. She carried it without question. The forest grew darker. Not because of cloud or time, because it was withholding. It was folding itself inward, like a breath drawn and held. Mio moved through it gently, pressing no weight where it did not wish to bear it. She found fewer paths now, but each one led somewhere precise. A pool the size of her hand, frozen from beneath. A tree with one branch burning orange though its neighbors had long faded. A mound of earth that pulsed faintly with heat. Each encounter gave her nothing. Each one offered everything. At home, her uncle began weaving. Not baskets. Lines. Strips of bark and fiber, bent and layered over each other without pattern, without explanation. He did not stop when Mio entered. He did not look up when she sat beside him. But he handed her a strand. And together they wove. It did not form anything. Not yet. But it held. The forest did not speak that night. The house held its breath. And Mio, lying awake with her hands open, felt the hush descend upon her, not with warning, not with fear, but with welcome. The names of the forest were wintering. And so was she. Chapter 13, When the Canopy Opens. Snow did not fall that morning. It descended. Each flake made its way through the web of branches with reverence, slipping past needles and twigs as though guided by memory rather than gravity. The sky wore no color. It simply was, vast and unmarked, and Mio, standing in its light, felt as though she had entered the still space between heartbeats. The forest made no sound. Not even the hush of snow upon bark. But it moved. In the tilt of a branch. In the lean of a trunk that hadn't leaned yesterday. The silence was no longer stillness. It was listening. Mio awoke with her name resting on her chest. Not spoken. Not written. Not remembered from a dream. Given. She had no need to rise quickly. The house was warm. Her uncle's tools were arranged neatly along the wall, and the fire had not gone out overnight. Outside, the wind combed the eaves in soft, circular patterns. Still, she rose. Not to leave something, but to arrive. She did not dress for cold. It didn't touch her. The snow opened as she stepped through it, each print filling behind her with new powder, as if the forest refused to let her trail be followed. There was no path. She no longer needed one. Where she walked, the trees cleared a narrow breath between them. Where she paused, the light gathered. Where she listened, the air responded. And where she remembered, the forest opened. It began with color. Beneath the white, a shimmer of green. Beneath that, gold. Not rich, not royal, but ancient, like the edge of a leaf preserved in amber. She stepped through ferns that should have withered, and bark that had bloomed rather than hardened. Then came the voices. Not loud, not words. Whispers. Not all meant for her. Not all meant for now. But she heard them. And they heard her. The glade appeared like a breath released. In its center stood the tree she had seen in the reflection weeks ago. Not the tallest. Not the oldest. But the first. Its bark was not smooth or rough, but known. Its roots split into 7 paths. She stood at the 8th. The branches did not reach, they received. She approached without question. At its base lay a hollow. Inside, a single shape. A form carved in stone, worn with time, but still whole. A spiral within a spiral, echoing the one she had touched in the bowl. She placed her hand upon it. It did not open. It welcomed. Around her, the forest began to sing. No music. No melody. Just the resonance of life remembering itself. Each note was a tree. Each rhythm a stream. Each breath, the sound of something finding its shape. and she within it was neither guest nor guardian. She was part of root, of reach, of renewal. A wind passed through the canopy above. For a moment, the sky showed itself, not empty, full of light, of history, of names spoken before language. She looked up and saw no sky, no stars. She saw herself, not as she was, not as she would be, but as she had always been, the child beneath the cedar, the girl among the roots, the keeper of the whisper that had no mouth. Time folded in. She stood in the hollow with both hands open. The stone spiral glowed faintly, then dimmed, then disappeared. In its place, a ribbon. Soft, pale, unwritten. She took it and turned. The forest had shifted, not to conceal, to continue. The snow still fell. The branches still breathed. The silence still held. But now it waited for the next name, the next keeper, the next whisper. Mia walked home slowly. Her uncle was outside, watching the trees. He did not speak. He did not need to. She placed the ribbon upon the sill and lit a small flame beside it. Not for warmth, for remembering. The house filled with the scent of cedar and ash. She closed her eyes, and the canopy, far above, opened just wide enough for the light to return.
Thanks for listening. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next story.